in South America and then sold, to the United States, right? And elsewhere, right? So the EU was facing a problem, that actually, this this one, yeah, it's like a little tornado here, okay? Okay, so in the European market, right? So consumers were buying actually bananas, which were actually priced a little lower, than bananas from big American fruit companies like Dole, United Fruits, right? So what was the reason? Well, the reason was that the bananas, from the US, going into the European market were facing higher tariffs, okay? Importation taxes, right? And therefore the sales price was not competitive compared to the European fruits that were imported, from, as I just said, right, plantations maybe from Southeast Asia or from the African continent. So the US filed, a complaint towards WTO and said this is not fair, okay? The Europeans are unfairly, putting up, entry barriers in form of, tariffs on our products, okay, making us not competitive in terms of pricing, okay? So this was called the banana war, right? And what did the EU respond? Okay, so the EU tried to argue, okay, that the reason why US fruits, US imports, fruit imports were facing tariffs was because they paid subsidies, to the plantations in Southeast Asia and the African continent to make the produce cheaper. And they claim, or they dubbed it, to be development, agricultural, development subsidies for developing countries. Okay, so that's how the EU argued. Okay, they are saying, okay, we are subsidizing our plantations there because actually we are helping, those developing countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, actually have a chance, to compete with us here in the European market. So we are actually doing something good, okay? So what I want to say is sometimes, these entry barriers in form of tariffs or disguised subsidies, they actually come in hidden forms, okay? You can actually create entry barriers by maybe not directly imposing tariffs, but actually by subsidizing, the products to make it cheaper, okay? Another example that you should know about, okay? You should know, tariffs are not always illegal. Sometimes tariffs are justified, okay? So one situation where tariffs are justified even under WTO regulation is the so-called safeguard measure, okay? What is a safeguard measure? To safeguard something means to protect, right? So if you think, like in the case of the US currently, right, they're imposing a lot of tariffs on different kinds of products, to all trade partners actually, right? So the American government is arguing, okay, we are imposing tariff because our national economy is at stake, okay, our national industries are at stake. They are being endangered, they are facing difficulties, adjusting, to the cheap imports from other countries, okay? So because of this, we want to use the safeguard mechanism, the safeguard excuse, to impose tariffs on imports, on imports from other countries. Okay, so this is called safeguard measure. Okay, so WTO members, they can legally apply tariffs if they think that some domestic industries are facing existential threat because of cheap imports. unfairly cheap imports from other countries. Yeah? So they may impose tariffs, of course, only for temporary time. This is temporarily, this is a temporary measure, okay? It's not intended to be long term, okay? Yeah? So you can impose, for example, tariffs for half a year, okay, or maybe 1 year, to give yourself some time and to give your domestic players, domestic companies, some time to adjust, you know, and to, you know, take measures, you know, to reorganize themselves, you know, or to adapt, you know, the strategies to become more competitive, yeah. So safeguard measure, you know, is intended to give yourself some more time to adjust, you know, to specific adverse market situations, okay? And I think this is actually, you know, what the US is currently doing, right? They use this as an excuse, right? As a pretext, right? To say, okay, for example, American steel industry, American automotive industry, right? Yeah. There are steep tariffs now, you know, on imports from other countries, right? And so they want to give themselves more time, you know, to adjust, you know, to the new market situation, to the adverse market situation. Okay, so yeah, hidden forms of market entry, barriers. Okay, so today we move on. Actually, here, you know, to, you know, I was already mentioning, right, WTO, right, to introduce and also discuss three organizations, supranational organizations, which actually provide, you know, or yeah, actually, you know, the framework for international trade to happen. Okay, so these are the global institutions, three of them that are fundamental, you know, for international trade to be implemented and to happen, right? And actually, these three institutions, today we know them as WTO, IMF, and World Bank Group, right? They were actually created before the end or at the end of the Second World War. Yeah, so you picture, you know, the situation back 80 years ago, right? 1944, right? By the way, yeah, one of the main reasons why World War II was fought, right, was actually economic depression, right? Economic problems, right? Yeah, the Great Depression, you know, in the 1930s, right? 1929, you know, in 1933, you know, this Great Depression was actually one of the main reasons, you know, why World War II actually broke out. Because whenever you have this adverse, you know, economic situation or downturn, people have no jobs, okay, high unemployment rate, a lot of poverty, people have no money, no purchasing power, people are not satisfied, are unhappy, right? This is actually a, you know, situation which is very conducive, right, to the rise of extremism, to the rise of nationalism, right, and aggression, you know. Also, it would give rise, you know, to nations, you know, using this as a pretext, you know, to invade other countries, right, or to, you know, go into war, you know, and show aggression towards other countries, right? So that was exactly the situation in Europe, yeah, before and during, you know, World War II, right? So because of this, yeah, and of course, whenever you have economic downturn, you see the rise of protectionism, right? Yeah. Right? If your economy is not doing well, you naturally want to protect yourself, right, from foreign aggression or foreign competition, right? So in 1944, that was shortly before the end of the Second World War, the world leaders, they came together to have a meeting in Bretton Woods. Okay, so that's why it's called the Bretton Woods Agreement, right? And the main issue they discussed there was, well, they had this idea of creating a new foundation after the Second World War, to create a new foundation for the global community, for all the countries to work together, a new economic framework, economic trade foundation, that would foster trade amongst each other as a tool to create more wealth. And because of wealth, there would be more stability in society, right? There would be lasting peace in society, right? If everybody has a job, if economy is doing good, is doing great, right? Your pockets are filled, and you have a good life, right? Nobody will think, about war or about aggression, right? So that was the idea here at the end of the Second World War, that world leaders, they were thinking how to prevent future wars happening, right? So they came up with this framework to create a new foundation, which would include, the creation of these three organizations, which would then, foster and international trade and to make international trade actually possible. Okay, so these are the three organizations. Let's take a look at the first one. Okay, we know it now as the WTO, right? But actually, in the beginning, it was not called WTO. It was the GATT, right? Yeah, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right? And as the name implies already, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right? Yeah, it was actually a framework, it was actually a platform, where member states could just sit down, have a round table, use round table, that kind of concept, to talk about trade problems, to talk about trade disputes, and then to settle that disputes through negotiation, okay? That was in the beginning, right? So that's what's said here, right? The GATT was created as an agency, right? As a platform to watch over world trade and also to provide these roundtables, yeah? And the mechanisms, to discuss trade problems. And the biggest goal here, of course, is to reduce or eliminate altogether entry barriers in the form of tariffs. Okay, so this is one big goal, or the major goal of GATT and later on WTO, right? The reduction of entry barriers, in the form of tariffs, elimination of tariffs, right? Creating a free trade environment, yeah? Fair competition, yeah? Fair competition would mean that regardless whether you are a big country or a small country, right? Theoretically, whether you are a developed country or an advanced economy, right? We provide a platform for everybody to have a chance, to voice, their concern and to discuss problems, trade problems, and to solve them in the form of negotiation, right? Okay, so trading without discrimination, encouraging economic development and reform. So encouraging all the countries to open up the markets for free trade, okay? So WTO or GATT at that time certainly viewing free trade as, as a very, very, ultimate goal, as something very good, okay? Why I say that? Because today we are going to discuss about this. How do you think about free trade, right? Do you think that's necessary? Or do you think we could all be, self-sufficient, right? Yeah, and just, focus on our domestic borders, domestic economy, right? Just like the US is doing right now, right? Yeah. What are the pros and cons here? Do we really need free trade in order to flourish? Okay. Yeah, but at that time, GATT said, free trade can enhance, the wealth of nations for everybody, and therefore create, more stable societies and therefore, is the foundation, for lasting peace. Okay. So GATT, actually took place, or the operation, on an operational level. Okay. GATT was taking place in the form of round tables. Okay, so it was called round table because the disputing nations could just sit down and discuss with each other. So depending on where the round table took place, each round table had a nickname, right? So there was, for example, 1947, it started with Cuba. Cuba at that time was not on the blacklist yet, okay, so it took place in Cuba, so it was called the Havana round, right? The capital city of Cuba is called Havana, 1947. 1949 was in France, in 1955, and in the 60s, 1960s, there were 3 consecutive rounds in Geneva, so we call it the Geneva round 1, 2, and 3, okay? And each round would, as far as duration is concerned, right? There is no, standard, okay, as to how long, each round table would take in order to solve the dispute, right? Some round tables can be solved very quickly, but some round tables take many years, to solve. And even some round tables, they take place over 10 years and cannot resolve the problem. Okay, this was the latest one actually here, right? This one, right? The Doha round was a failure. Okay, it was, it says right here, right? It was started in Doha, that's why it's called Doha round, right? In 2001. Okay, and it consisted of several consecutive rounds, actually using smaller round tables, depending on what trade issue was discussed or negotiated and which nations, took place, right? So there were different locations for the Doha round. Actually, it was not only Doha, right? Some of the negotiations took place in Hong Kong, some of them in Mexico, in Paris, etc. But the overall, big round was called Doha round because it was initiated there, right? And it was ended in 2016. So started 2001, ended 2016. So 15 years after these efforts, it was ended without resolution. Okay, and the reason why, is listed here, okay? The Doha round was also nicknamed the development round because the main issue here of the trade dispute, the main issue was actually one between developing nations versus developed nations, okay? The developing nations, or the global south, right, was complaining, that they were not adequately reflected, or protected, in international trade. They were, actually treated unfairly. Okay, they do not have a fair stake in participating in international trade. Why? Because the, developing countries, they are facing a lot of trade barriers when it comes to their products. So what kind of products are developing nations actually producing and exporting? Well, labor-intensive products, right? Like textiles, agricultural produce, right? So these are the main produce and also the main export items, right, of developing countries going into export, being exported, for example, to Europe or to the US, right? But exactly these products, these type of products were facing higher tariffs, textiles, agriculture, for example, right, which make up 70% of exports of developing nations, right? So these are the key problem areas here. So the developing nations were demanding a reduction of these tariffs on their product, and at the same time, they were also calling for an end to subsidies in the US and in EU. So in US and also in the EU, yeah, a lot of subsidies, financial subsidies, are actually provided to the local farmers, okay, to make them more competitive, okay? Yeah, so the EU Commission providing money, subsidies to European farmers, you know, to let them stay competitive, okay? And the developing nations, right? They said this is not fair. You are subsidizing, you know, agricultural products. So how can we, or how can our products, you know, stay competitive in your market, right? This is unfair. So they are calling for an end, or were calling for an end, you know, to these national subsidies in the developed nations, okay? Yeah, and guess what? Okay, so the developed nations were not willing, you know, to give up, yeah, or to compromise on that, right? Yeah. So the Doha round then was not resolved, but as you know, there were spin-offs, right, from the Doha round. Yeah, spin-offs, which means that actually those many nations that took place, you know, in the Doha round, right? They, after conclusion, yeah, after they, you know, after the Doha round was officially, you know, closed down, right? There were spin-offs in the form of smaller roundtables, right? Of smaller, you know, negotiation groups, you know, where nations then pursued, you know, further pursued, you know, negotiation to hopefully, you know, reach an agreement. And those spin-offs, we know them. We know them because one of the spin-off is today's CPTPP, right? Because CPTPP, after the Doha round, right, in 2016, right, there was a spin-off called TPP, yeah, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which was actually initiated by the US, right, to create a very large free trade area here in the Pacific Rim, right? So it's called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, initiated by the US. However, in 2016, right, I think that was when Donald Trump, in his first round, right, he was president, right? When he became president, right, he announced that the US would step back from TPP. Yeah, they were not interested in TPP anymore. Okay, so the US withdrew from TPP, yeah, leaving 11 other countries, primarily Japan. Who else is there? Australia, right? Some Southeast Asian nations, yeah. New Zealand, right? Yeah, and also Chile, you know, on the other end of the Pacific Ocean, right, in the Americas, right? Yeah, yeah. So those remaining 11 nations, they nevertheless, without US, right? They said we want to progress, yeah, and conclude on TPP. So they signed it. They signed the TPP agreement without the US in 2017, right? And they called it or renamed it CPTPP, okay, the Comprehensive Progressive TPP, so to say. Yeah, so it's a newer version of the original TPP, right? Yeah, so that was in 2018, making CPTPP the third largest free trade area in the world, okay? And guess what? Who is now observer state? Or who is now the candidacy? Who has applied to become new members? Because CPTPP, of course, is growing, right? Yeah, gaining new members, right?
The UK.
The UK, yeah. Who else?
Taiwan?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Taiwan has applied already, right? I think already 2 years ago, right? check it, okay? For inclusion, yeah, for membership, CPTPP, right?
Check it.
Yeah, check it, okay? Another spin-off here is TTIP. Okay, so you have Trans-Pacific, right? Partnership here, yeah, focusing on the Pacific, rim. On the other hand, you know, you have this TTIP, which focuses on transatlantic partnership, right? So TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was pursued as a spin-off, right, from the Doha round, right, by US and the EU, right? Yeah, so they wanted to, to create, a close alliance, establish a free trade, true free trade area between cross-Atlantic, right? But because of some concern from the Europeans, right? The Europeans were afraid farmers, for example, or some lobbyist groups, environmentalists, and also consumers were concerned that if you have this transatlantic, this kind of free trade area, there would be a lot of, American products, for example, agricultural products, yeah, coming into the European market, which are, which have lower, for example, environmental standards and also food safety standards, as compared to European standards. So they were very concerned about this. One example, genetically manipulated food, right? So in the US, you have a lot, it's natural, right? Yeah, there's a lot of GMO produced there, right? But Europeans are very sensitive on this, okay? They don't want, to eat genetically manipulated food. But if you have a free trade area, you have to allow American brands to come into your market, right? Yeah. So there was a lot of concern. People were protesting, and so finally, the TTIP was stalled. Yeah, was stopped. Okay, the negotiations were stopped. Okay. Well, let's see. How it evolves. There is now some. Maybe some initiatives, for example, right, between EU and Canada, yeah, because Canada has now been let down by the United States, right? What was that? Yeah. Okay, it should not be an alarm, right? Okay. Yeah. So because the United States, right, NAFTA, USMCA, right, was let down by the US. So maybe, there will be, closer, negotiations between EU, cooperation between EU and Canada, right? CETA, Canada-EU agreement, right? Yeah. Okay, so Doha round, just an example of a failure. Okay, a failed negotiation here. So what I want you to say is, when did GATT become WTO? So that was in 1986 during the Uruguay round, okay, in South America, yeah, 1986 till 1993, 5 years, for that negotiation to take place to resolve. During that Uruguay round, the GATT members, decided, to transform GATT into a formal organization called WTO. Yeah. Why formal organization? Because if you are not a formal organization, the conclusions, yeah, or the agreements reached by GATT, they are just, accepted on a voluntary basis. Okay, so the nations are not per law, required to, to implement, the decision. Yeah, so it was on a voluntary basis. You could follow, the decision of GATT, or you can also say, no, I don't want, I reject it, okay? So in order to issue formally binding decisions, GATT was then transformed or changed into a formal organization called World Trade Organization, okay? So the WTO currently, you may want to check it. Yeah, you may want to check it, right? Has around 165 or something member states. Okay, it's getting more. Okay, so there are throughout time, throughout the years, new members joining, of course, the WTO, right? And there are several observer states. Okay, so these are candidates that are applying, to become members, right? Okay, and the WTO provides a panel of experts. So they have experts in different industries, right, that serve as, you could say, as a kind of judge. Okay, so it's like you go to court, yeah? You two people are fighting, right? They are in dispute, and then they bring this issue to court, and you have this, you have these, these experts, to listen, to your complaints and to your viewpoints, right? And then to make a judgment, yeah, to make a decision, a binding decision, yeah, a binding ruling, right? Yeah. So this is. WTO, right? And focusing on the